So my Old Testament professor, Tony Craven, was a wonderful and beautiful scholar. And she taught me the invaluable tools of exegesis and hermeneutics. And exegesis and hermeneutics are just fancy words which mean to glean the meaning of. You look at the historical context, you look at the form and the rhetoric, you look to see what those first century peers would have heard. You look at the Bible in sort of a devotional way to hopefully open up what God's Spirit has to say to not only the people who read it in the first century, but also the people who are reading it today. What does the story tell us about God, about ourselves, about our relationship with God? And Dr. Craven would always insist that if we ever read stories in which there was actual dialogue, that we not only be open to the idea that God might be speaking for God's self, or God might be speaking through someone else speaking, but we should always look for the voice of God in those who are not allowed to speak. And so I offer you today a 21st century beatitude which might seem like a paradox. Blessed are the voiceless. Now, I did a Google search of the word voiceless, and these were the myriad of responses that just kind of popped off the screen. Animals, people in domestic violence situations, refugees and undocumented people fleeing in terror, the incarcerated who had been put into prolonged situations of solitary confinement, the poor and ethnic minorities around the world who either haven't been given the right to vote or have had their right to vote taken away, the untouchables, which are the lowest caste in India, young boys and girls who are caught up in the sex slave industry, or those young boys and girls who have been violated by clergy over the decades, the mentally ill, the homeless, people living with Alzheimer's, the elderly and children in war zones, gay teens stuck in a situation or trapped or being bullied in school. These are just a few of the things that sort of popped off of the screen when you just type in Google, the voiceless. This took no real digging on my part whatsoever. And I bet if I opened it up to all of you, that you could name another dozen or so people who have the characteristics in which we would claim in society and the culture as being people who have no voice. But I bet none of us, regardless of the list that I read or the other dozen that we could come up with as a group, would say that those people who have those characteristics are lucky or happy or blessed. I think one reason why we wouldn't say that is because I think it's just somewhat preposterous for us to think that someone in this day and age can't have a voice when you can just start a blog on any Thursday and like start writing and put it on social media and just sort of throw it out there for the masses. What do you mean we can't have a voice? Or I think it's so preposterous to think that those who don't have a voice would be considered happy or lucky or blessed because our voice is so important to us. Let's take our church as like sort of a microcosm of like the entire society. Voice is so important to us that we would never take away someone's voice. I mean, you could stand up and start talking right now, and I would stop, and we would start listening to you. We take voice very seriously in this community. Think about it. At every council meeting or congregational meeting or ministry meeting or staff meeting, before we take a vote on anything, the last thing we say is there anything else that anyone else would like to say? Voice is so important that we offer it even when we take other things away. If you come to a congregational meeting or a staff meeting or a ministry or a council meeting and you're not a quote-unquote formal member, well, you can't vote, but you have voice. And if there's an issue of abuse in this church that needs to be handled with discretion, then we have a whole policy in place that takes every single person's situation into consideration, allows them to have a voice, and then advocates for their voice on their behalf. And yet, Here is a story in our sacred Bible which is all about voicelessness. This story is about the sound of silence, and it is deafening. And yet I tell you, Dinah is blessed. How many of you knew the story before it was read? And how many of you who raised your hand knew the story from the Bible, but knew it from Anita Diamant's story, The Red Tent? But the chances are, if you'd heard it before, you didn't hear it in church. Because again, it's not part of the lectionary. This is a story that for whatever reason, the church has decided it should not be told. And when we do hear this story, maybe for the first time, we hear and we often say, "What? That's in the Bible?" This is the reason why a buddy of mine who is a youth minister in Connecticut walks around with a parental advisory sticker on his Bible for stories just like this. So Dinah is the daughter of Leah, which is Jacob's first wife, the unfavored wife. And she is living in a land which is not her own, and being lonely as the only daughter in a large family of boys, she goes out to seek companionship with the other girls of her region. And then Shechem, the son of the chief of that region, finds her, and as the New Revised Standard Version puts it, quote unquote, saw her, took her, and lay with her by force. In other words, he rapes her. And the rest of the chapter is the details of the aftermath of the rape. And Shechem decides, either out of guilt or maybe out of, trueness, that he loves her and he wants to marry her. But Dinah's two brothers, Simon and Levi, are so rageful that they decide that they're going to revenge her by killing and murdering Shechem's entire clan. Now, Dinah is the only person, did you catch that? In the story, Dinah is the only person in the story who isn't allowed to talk. She's the only person in the story that we don't hear from. And yet she's doubly violated over the centuries because rabbinic and theological scholars have interpreted this story by placing the blame of her actions on her. Centuries of great Jewish sages and legendary Christian theologians have read into this story that Dinah broke one of God's laws and therefore she did this to herself. There's a portion of Midrash, and Midrash is an old volume of Jewish sort of debate by wonderful and amazing Jewish sages who just debate back and forth over Torah portions. And this is the first question that the old Jewish sages said about this story. What was Dinah doing to put herself in that situation? And these rabbis go off from there. The Midrash asks the question, what was Dinah doing that caused her to come into contact with Shechem? And they seize on this portion of the story. Dinah went out. She went out into town, which is to say, she did a very unusual thing for women in that day and age, in that she left the encampment of the men. Therefore, she went out into the city where provocative things happen. In other words, she invited the rape to occur. She brought it upon herself. And while this attitude might be far-fetched in this congregation, as we read this story, we also know that this is not uncommon in everyday life, when 78% of domestic violence, abuse, and rape and date rapes do not get reported to the authorities. Society often blames the victim. Society shames the victim for not having a voice or for not using their voice. They often say, well, if you hadn't done this, well, then that wouldn't have happened to you. And sadly, because of this, the victim often blames and shames themselves. So we need to first be very clear on this perspective that it is harmful and dangerous and wrong to blame the victim. Because abuse of any kind is about power and control. Now, this is not the type of story that normally gets taught in Sunday school. It's probably not the story you were hoping to be read this morning in church. But we need to talk about it. We need to look at it very closely. Because I truly think that these types of stories in our Bible say something very important to us. That if we ignore the silence of Dinah, and we ignore any thought of emotion that she might have had, then she remains silent. And we don't know what she might have felt. And therefore, we don't know what other people who are in her situation might be feeling. Now, we hear from Shechem and Hamor. We hear from Jacob and his sons. We hear from the men, the empowered, the vengeful, the angry, the deceitful. Oh, we hear from them. Not only in this story, but in the stories around the world. But we never hear from Dinah. And we never hear from those men, or from those women, and those children of Shechem's clan who are enslaved. And we never hear from the animals, which were taken as property to Jacob's tribe. We never hear from the voiceless. And we never hear from God. So Dr. Craven would scream at us from the front of the class whenever we encountered a story in which God never talks. And she would ask us, what does it mean that a God of love is voiceless or silent in a story? What does it mean that the God whose very nature is love has nothing to say in this story? It means we need to listen. We need to listen to the voiceless. We need to listen to those who have no one else to listen to them. That whole list that we started the sermon with, we need to listen to them, truly listen to them. Because as Oscar Romero, the Archbishop, once commented, that in the ordeal of Christ's trial and arrest and execution, he never utters a word to the corrupt authorities who ask him questions. Instead, to those in power and to those who abused his power, he remains silent. And Oscar Romero says that's on purpose. Because he's standing in solidarity with the widow and the orphan, with the oppressed, with those who society silences. He stands in solidarity with the voiceless. And he stands with those who society just does not want to hear from. And then Romero, in one of his most famous sermons, looks out upon his congregation and he asks them the most provocative question. So who are you listening to? Oliver Wendell Holmes, in 1858, wrote a haunting verse called "The Voiceless," about the dead who die nameless and the life they led that broke them. And he wrote it as an ode to the outcast and to the shunned who were ignored in life and forgotten in death. And this is what he writes in the last stanza. If singing breath or echoing chord to every hidden pang were given, what endless melodies were poured, as sad as earth, as sweet as heaven. If we listen to the voiceless, what might they say to us that is as sad as earth or as sweet as heaven? If we listen to the voiceless, what might they say which is as sad as earth or as sweet as heaven? In the late 1980s, there was a button that sort of caught on in New York and San Francisco and in Europe. The button was simply silence equals death. It was related to the AIDS epidemic and the necessity to talk about that disease and that ailment and that virus. Silence equals death. This sentence is true. It was true then and it's true now. That if we don't give a space for Dinahs and the Dinahs of the world to speak, then they will remain voiceless. And what sadness and sweetness might we miss? So in memory of her, and in honor of those whose voice have been taken away from them, or they were never given a voice to begin with, a blank space remains. And all we can do is fill that blank space with our imagination, with what we think she would say, or we think they would say, and we can create a safe space for them to share their voice with us. So blessed are the voiceless, for their song shall be as sad as earth and as sweet as heaven. And there shall be the voice of God.